My name is Paul, and I live in a small village with about 600 people, where almost everyone knows each other. This story is about my Uncle George, who raised me and my sister. The three of us lived together. My uncle was a good man. Everyone in the village knew him. He was a mechanic, and people often came by asking for his help, which he never denied. But when I was 16 and he was 40, our lives changed forever. One late night, I was helping my sister with her homework when my uncle came home with blood on his face, shirt, and legs. It was strange. I always heard him arriving with the sound of his car, but this time he came walking. He entered the house looking like he had seen a ghost, scared and unable to speak. I was very worried. I had never seen him like that. He was always talkative and positive. He was disoriented, and I asked him repeatedly what happened. After a while, he finally said he had a car accident. I kept asking questions to see if he was okay and where it happened, but he stayed silent. He went straight to his room and laid on his bed, trembling. I immediately grabbed a towel and helped him clean all the blood. The wounds didn't look severe, so I thought the accident wasn't major, and he didn't need to go urgently to the hospital. I mentioned calling an ambulance, but he, still in shock, insisted not to call and that he was fine. Physically, he seemed fine, but mentally, he wasn't. His eyes were wide open, scared, and he wouldn't talk. I helped clean him, gave him new clothes, and let him rest. The next day, I went to his room to see how he was doing, and he said he was fine, but he wasn't going to work. He wanted to rest. Understandable. He really needed it. Later that day, the police came by to see him, because they found his car on the side of the road, wrecked. They thought it was strange that he didn't report the crash. The officer knew my uncle, so I let him in. He went to his room, and they talked for a while. After they talked, the officer asked me to step outside. He explained that the accident was very unusual. It seemed like no one else was involved. Only my uncle crashed the car. But the way the front of the car looked was really strange. They couldn't understand what happened, and my uncle wouldn't tell him anything. He seemed to be in another world, like he was still in shock and couldn't believe what happened. The officer told me not to worry. They would tow his car and investigate further. I prepared lunch for my uncle, brought it to his room, sat down close to him, and tried to talk. I asked him a few times to explain, but he would either tell me not to worry or remain silent. I couldn't get a word from him, nothing that would help me understand what happened or if he was really okay. The next day, someone came to the door, asking for his help with their car, but my uncle didn't even leave the room. He told me to tell the person he couldn't help and to leave. From that day, people in the village started coming by to try to help, bringing food and trying to talk, but my uncle didn't want to see anyone. He remained quiet in his room, watching TV and lying in bed. That night, things got even worse. He asked me for an empty bowl. I didn't know what it was for, but later when I brought him food, I noticed that he had used the bowl for his necessities. Now, he wouldn't even leave the room to go to the bathroom. From that day, my uncle couldn't take care of me and my sister anymore. Instead, I started taking care of them, cooking, cleaning the house, and sadly, cleaning after him. He wouldn't go to the bathroom anymore. He wouldn't even take a shower. I had to go to his bed with wet towels to help him clean himself. I tried asking for help, but no one could get a word from him. He only said that he was fine and would rather stay in his room. He said it was his safe space, and that's where he wanted to be. The police officer became a good friend and kept coming back to the house to talk to him and help me with some chores. Once, he told me that he investigated the car and no one could explain what happened. He even suggested that something paranormal might have happened, something out of this world that appeared to him, caused the damage, and left him in shock. Unfortunately, that's how my life would be for the next 20 years. I grew up, my sister grew up, and she also started taking care of my uncle. For 20 years, my uncle didn't leave his room, not once. At some point, I got used to it. That was how life was, and I just accepted it. Last year, we decided to renovate the house as it was getting old. We wanted to give my uncle a nice improvement to his room, with better colors and new furniture, and so we did. The room looked nice, but sadly that must have been too much for him. The old-looking room was his safe space. Now the new-looking room wasn't as comfortable. A week after we finished his room, my uncle got very sick. I remember it was 2 p.m. on a Sunday when he called me to his room. I was surprised by the strength in his voice. It was strong like I hadn't heard in years, but unfortunately, he wasn't as strong physically. He asked me to sit down close to him. He held my hand and looked at me like he wanted to say something, but at that very moment, he passed away. I still can't explain, and no one can, what happened in that accident that caused my uncle to spend 20 years afraid of leaving his room. I guess we'll never know. I'm just happy that now he doesn't need to fear anything, and he can finally rest after 20 years of being afraid. When we adopted Emma, she was 3 years old. My wife and I were overjoyed to give her a loving home. From the beginning, we were upfront with her about being adopted, and she seemed to accept it with ease. For the first few years, everything was perfect. Emma was a bright, imaginative child who loved playing in her upstairs toy room, which was filled with dolls, books, and all sorts of colorful toys. However, when Emma turned 6, we started noticing some strange behaviors. It began innocently enough. Little giggles or the sound of her talking to herself, which we assumed was just her playing pretend. But it soon became clear she wasn't just playing. One evening I overheard her talking as if having a conversation with someone. I peeked into the room to check, but she was alone, sitting by her dollhouse. I asked who she was talking to, and she simply smiled and said, "Luke." I thought it was cute at first, an imaginary friend. But things took a darker turn. A week later, while I was cooking dinner, Emma suddenly screamed from her toy room. I rushed upstairs, and she was standing in the middle of the room, pale and trembling. She told me Luke had knocked over her toys and was angry. As I tried to comfort her, the closet door creaked open on its own. I was frozen, staring into the empty closet. My wife arrived just in time to see the door slowly shutting again, but there was no one inside. After that night, Emma refused to play in her toy room anymore. The once lively child became withdrawn and fearful, waking up from nightmares where she'd whisper, "Luke is mad at me." We moved houses shortly after, hoping to leave the strange occurrences behind. But Emma never truly recovered. The invisible playmate had left a lasting scar. To this day, she refuses to sleep in any room with a closet, and the mention of the name Luke sends her into a quiet panic. It was late September, and I was still reeling from a tough breakup. My friends, always looking out for me, thought it would be a good idea to get away for the weekend. They had heard about an old family cabin deep in the woods, a place that hadn't been used in years. It wasn't far from where we grew up, and they thought the isolation and fresh air would be just what I needed to clear my head. We packed up for the weekend, eager for a little escape. The drive out was long, with the road narrowing into a dirt path as the woods thickened around us. The cabin stood at the end of it. It was an old wooden structure, weathered by time, but still sturdy. The place felt distant, cut off from the world, no cell service, no distractions. At first, it was perfect. We spent the first day gathering firewood, exploring the nearby trails, and settling in. We made a fire in the old stone fireplace and played cards late into the night. It felt good to laugh again, to forget about everything for a while. But that first night, something felt off. I was lying in bed when I heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from outside. It sounded like something dragging across the porch. I sat up, listening closely, but the noise faded away after a few minutes. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was probably some animal, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. The next day, I asked if anyone else had heard anything strange during the night. They hadn't. They laughed it off, teasing me about my imagination running wild in the middle of nowhere. I laughed too, trying to ignore the growing sense that something wasn't right. We spent the second day hiking, enjoying the isolation, but that night, things escalated. I was lying in bed again when I heard it, footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone trying to move quietly. My heart started racing. I strained to listen, but when I got up to check, nothing was there. The others were fast asleep, completely unaware. I stayed awake most of the night, every creak of the cabin making me jump. By the third night, The tension had built up inside me, but my friends remained blissfully unaware of anything strange. We had a late dinner and stayed up talking in the living room before finally heading to bed. I couldn't sleep, the anxiety twisting in my gut. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Then, around 3 a.m., I woke to a loud crash. I shot up in bed, and the noise came again. This time, it was unmistakable. The sound of plates crashing to the floor, books falling from shelves. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the living room, my friends close behind me, all of them now wide awake. What we saw stopped us in our tracks. The room was being torn apart right before our eyes. The front door was wide open, wind howling through the room like a hurricane, but only inside. Plates flew off the kitchen shelves, smashing to the ground. Books tumbled from the shelves, scattering across the floor. Chairs were tipped over, and the curtains flailed wildly, as if caught in a violent storm. We stood there, frozen, watching as the room continued to wreck itself. The wind was so strong we could barely hear each other over the chaos, but none of us said a word. There was nothing to say. We just stood there, stunned, as the destruction unfolded in front of us. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The wind died down, the plates stopped falling, and everything was still. The door was still wide open, but now there was no wind, nothing. Outside, the night was calm. It was as if the storm had only existed within the walls of the cabin. We stepped outside, looking around, but there was no sign of anything unusual. The trees were still, the air was cool and quiet. It was as though the world outside had no idea what had just happened. We didn't speak much after that. We went back inside, carefully stepping over the shattered plates and scattered books, and sat down in silence. No one could explain what we had just witnessed. We didn't even try. The next morning, we packed up and left without saying much. We never talked about what happened again, but I could see it in their faces. They were as shaken as I was. I haven't been back to the cabin since. Sometimes I think about that night and wonder what really happened. Whether it was the isolation or something darker, I'll never know.